The topic or the concept we shall be looking at is cell homeostasis. Now, when we talk about homeostasis is talking about or really means stability. Now, cell homeostasis actually is the maintenance of stable internal conditions or environment in cell to survive and carry out its functions. That is the process or the ability of the cell to be able to maintain a stable internal condition in spite of whatever is happening in the external environment. It's an active and a continuous process. That is, the process is active and it is continuous, and it is, a way by which the cell try to sense changes that is happening within and within the that is within the internal and the external environment in order to be able to normalize the situation and adjust itself to the changes. The cell actually works in the body to be able, that is, all the cells in our body work in the body to be able to keep the internal conditions within the optimal range. That is, keep the condition within an organism to be stable so that the external environment will not really affect what is happening in the internal environment. The cell homeostasis allows the cellular processes to operate correctly despite fluctuations that you have in the external environment. The process is the process by which the cell maintains a stable optimal internal environment. That is a process whereby the cell tries to maintain a stable condition, a stable environment internally in spite of whatever is happening in the external environment. It regulates the acidity and the alkalinity of the cell, regulates the temperature, regulates the nutrients, the ion concentrations, and so many other necessary things. So we can say that cell homeostasis is actually important for the survival of the cells to be able to work and carry out their activities and functions very well, and for the survival also of the organism. The cell is also will also be able to maintain the ability the stability of the internal environment. And now for the cell to be able to maintain the internal environment, cell membrane, that is that membrane that is surrounding the cell outside, that is preventing the cell from the outside environment, is actually important. And this cell membrane is the one that controls what enters the cell and what actually exits the cell. And on the membrane, there is we have particular fat like molecules that are surrounding, that are present on the membrane. And these fat like molecules that are present on the cell membrane, they are described as the phospholipid. These fat molecules, they are in double layers. That is, they are in two layers, and those two layers are a form of, they contain molecules that are fat-like, that is, molecules that looks like fat. The phospholipid actually enables the membrane to be able to allow certain things to pass and prevent certain other things from entering or passing, either entering or exiting. So we say in that case that the membrane is semi-permeable. Semi-permeable means that it allows certain substances or molecules to pass, while some molecules are not allowed to pass. The phospholipid is actually made up of the hydrophilic head. That is, that's what we call hydrophilic head. These ones are the parts of this layer, this bilayer that attracts water. And we have the two hydrophilic tools that repels water. The hydrophilic tools, they repel water. That is, they don't allow or they don't attract water. Now, wherever we have a watery environment, whether the watery environment is within, that is internally, or it is outside, that is in the immediate environment of the cell, it's there's a way that those molecules try to arrange themselves. What normally happens is that the hydrophilic head will face up while the toe the toes will be tucked in within the hydrophilic air. So what we're now trying to say is that when we have the hydrophilic air, we're going to have the toes being tucked in within the middle. So this arrangement is actually to be able to create a non-polar core, that is a non-polar situation that will make it difficult for substances that can dissolve in water, that is molecules that are referred to as water molecules, for them to be able to pass. Because if water molecules if water soluble molecules are able to pass, what is going to happen is that they're going to dissolve in the water along the way. So the membrane has to build up this type of arrangement of the phospholipid molecules in order to prevent the water soluble molecules from entering, especially when we have a watery internal or external environment. And it also, this arrangement also prevents charged ions from passing in or outside the cell. Now we're going to look at the mechanism of homeostasis in a cell. Substances are transported across the cell by two different mechanisms, either by passive mechanism or by active mechanism. Passive transport does not require energy. That is, when we talk about passive transport, it does not require energy, but it is just, on the movement from higher concentration to lower concentration, and this is simply referred to as a diffusion. What this one is trying to say is that does not require any energy for the movement. That is, this passive transport does not need any energy to move substances into the cell or for substances to exit the cell. Example of what we have the movement of oxygen. Oxygen moves from outside, where you have a higher concentration, into the cell where we have a lower concentration. So what we have, or what we are saying, is that there is no energy that is required. The cell just move from a region, or the substance will just move from a region where you have a higher concentration to a region or an area where you have a lower concentration. So this example of oxygen just move from outside the cell where you have a higher concentration into within the cell, inside the cell, where we have a lower concentration. The same way, carbon dioxide will move from within the cell, where we have a higher concentration, through the membrane outside to the outside environment, where we have a lower concentration of carbon dioxide. So this type of movement is simply described as a diffusion. And we have another type of diffusion process that is referred to as osmosis. What happens in this situation is that we have what we need to know in this case is that when it comes to diffusion process that is referred to as osmosis, semi-permeable membrane is involved. That is a membrane that will allow certain things to pass and will not allow some other things to pass, will be involved. Then another thing is that it involves the movement between solutions. When we say solution is actually made up of what we call solute and solvent. Solvent is what a substance is dissolved in, while the solute is what is dissolved in the substance. For example, when we talk about salt solution now, salt solution, for example, if we dissolve salt inside the water, then it becomes a solution. Now the water is referred to as the sulfate, while the salt that is dissolved inside the water is referred to as the solute. So when it comes to osmosis, what happens is that where you have a solution of higher concentration of oxygen of solute, then we have another solution of a lower concentration of solute. So we now have the movement of the solute from a lower concentration to an area where you have a higher concentration, and this will be a movement through the semi-permeable membrane. An example of osmosis in living organism is the movement of water, that is the movement of water into the root of plants. The inside the plant you have a higher concentration of salt. So you have the movement of water from outside in the sand or in the soil moving into the plant, through the roots, passing through the cell membranes or the cell walls into the roots of the plant by the process of osmosis. So we have that as simple or another form of diffusion. Now we have a situation where large molecules like glucose may not be able to move across the membrane. So this type of molecule, or the movement of these large molecules, are being facilitated by or with the help of protein channels. That is, we have what we call protein channels that will help or assist in the movement of large molecules like glucose, and this type of diffusion is referred to as a facilitated diffusion. Now we talk about active transport. The active transport, which is the second type of movement into the cell and outside, as it's within the cell, is the type of movement or transport that requires energy. That is, energy is required for this type of movement to take place. So to move substances against their gradient within the cell, energy is required. So what this one is saying is that within the cell, we have a situation where some substances move from one location within the cell, that is inside the cell itself, to another location where they will be, their targeted solution where they will be used. For example, we have a situation where when proteins are synthesized somewhere, they will have to move to another part of the cell, just within the cell. So when this type of situation occur, or when this type of movement or transport take place, it is an active transport because energy is required, and the energy that is usually used or required for this type of transport is given or being supplied by ATP. ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and this adenosine triphosphate is actually being synthesized by the mitochondria that are spread within the cell. So within the cell, substances are moved from low concentration to higher concentration. That is, you have substances that are moved from where they are of lower concentration to where they are of higher concentration. This is often accomplished by the protein bombs that are embedded within the cell membranes. We have what we call protein bombs. They are within the cell membrane, so they help in the accomplishment of this type of movement. And an example that I have put here is sodium-potassium bomb. In sodium-potassium bomb, we have the pushing of sodium ion from within the cell out of the cell, and this process brings in potassium ions into the cell. So while sodium is being pushed out of the cell, we have potassium being pushed in or coming in within or into the cell through the cell membrane. So this happens as a result of active transport that requires the use of energy, and the energy that is being used are being generated right within the cell from the mitochondria, which is ATP, and it's usually being generated by the process of respiration. So to transport larger materials like proteins, the cell needs or uses a more complex active transport. That is, to transport this more complex materials into the cell or outside the cell, a more complex active transport take place. And these are divided into two or categorized into two. We have the endocytosis and the exocytosis. For the endocytosis, when the cell wants to bring in a substance, a complex or large material, what it does is that it engulfs the material. That is, it tries to stretch its membrane to surround the material until it has completely surrounded the material. And in this case, when it has surrounded the material, it will now form a fascicle within the cell. That's how the material comes inside the cell, and that process is described as a endocytosis. We also have exocytosis. It's the same process but opposite. What happens in this case is that the material, the material will now move towards very close to the cell membrane. And in this case, the cell fuses a vesicle with the membrane. That is, that particular substance will have been within the vesicle within the cell. That is, within as one of the organelles within the cell. So it will now move very close to the membrane and releases the substances out into the surrounding environment. Now, let's look at it. What happens when cell loses its balance? That is, loss of cell balance. Cell can lose its balance when the cells or homeostatic mechanisms can no longer cope with stress. That is, we have a situation where it is possible that the cell cannot maintain the balance, the homeostasis. At this time, the cell enters a state of distress. This could happen due to infection. That is, if the cell is infected, or maybe as a result of toxins within the cell, then the cell cannot balance, that it cannot remove and balance the situation within, or there is a deficiency in the nutrient that is being taken by maybe the organism or within the cell. So when any of this happens, if the damage is severe, that is, if the damage is much, very much, the balance cannot be restored. That is, it means that the cell will not be able to maintain an optimal range, a balance or a stable situation internally. So the cell may activate a self-destructive sequence. That is, when the cell discover that it's in distress, it can no longer balance the stable environment. That means the external environment and the internal environment of the cell cannot be balanced. So the cell try to enter what we call self destructive sequence. This is referred to as the apoptosis. That is apoptosis. What this means is self-destruction, like cell suicide. That is, the cell tries to commit what we call a suicide. So the process is very important because it prevents the damaged cell from harming its neighbors. That is, when a particular cell has been damaged, in order to prevent the damage from reaching the neighboring cells, it's better for the cell to commit its suicide, that is, to destroy itself. And this happens a lot of time. And this is good because it will prevent, because if this happens and it prevents the neighboring cells from being damaged, it prevents this from spreading to all other parts of the body. So the cell shrinks and break down into small contained fragments that are cleaned up by immune system. So when the cell breaks itself down and destroys itself, the immune system tries to clean it off. And when it cleans it off, it destroys it as a way by which the body will clean it off and maintain the immunity within the cell and within the organism. So this is what we mean by cell apoptosis. And this is what we mean actually by cell homeostasis. When the cell is trying to maintain a balanced environment within its cell, irrespective of whatever is happening outside in the outside environment. This is the process that makes us to be balanced. That is, irrespective of whatever be the temperature, for example, in the outside environment, the temperature within us is still balanced, is still maintained, is still being stable. So we have, in that case, we have homeostasis taking place. When the cells cannot carry out homeostasis, then it becomes a problem, and this problem or problems begin to generate, from one problem now begins to lead to another problem, and gradually the cells become destroyed, and it comes to the whole or to most of the cells in the body, and it becomes a problem to the body of the organism, and the body will not be able to maintain a balance again. and the body will now be affected with whatever is happening in the outside environment. Thank you very much for listening.